Beneath Greenland's ice sheets, global powers see untapped wealth, rare earth minerals, new Arctic sea routes, and the promise of tourism revenue. In 2025, the government advanced several mining permits, including a 30-year concession for a northocite extraction, while more contentious projects such as K. Vainfjeld remain unresolved under a strict uranium ban that continues to drive litigation and multi-million-dollar arbitration claims. At the same time, tourism has become a concrete force in the economy. Visit Greenland's latest reports show the sector accounts for 4.9% of GDP and supports about 1,800 jobs, with Statistics Greenland recording a 14% rise in international passenger numbers this January compared to a year earlier. Fishing quotas have also been reshaped, with small coastal towns voicing concern that new allocations threaten long-standing livelihoods. The central question is whether these growing revenues, whether from visitors, minerals, or new policies, will remain in Greenland to support local communities or flow outward to foreign investors. To understand this transformation, we begin with the story of new runways and the traffic now filling Greenland's skies. Greenland's new gateways to the world. In November 2024, Greenland marked a turning point with the opening of Nuuk's new international airport, followed soon after by the expansion of Ilulissat's runway. For the first time, wide-body jets could land on Greenlandic soil, enabling direct transatlantic service that previously required inconvenient stopovers. Within months, carriers revealed concrete plans. United Airlines announced a seasonal Newark-Nuuk connection beginning in June 2025. SAS resumed its direct Copenhagen-Nuuk flights, while Icelandair and Air Greenland expanded their services linking Greenland to Europe and North America. The significance was immediate. Greenland now had reliable, routine access to major hubs, linking its economy and communities more closely to the world than ever before. Traffic numbers quickly reflected the shift. Statistics Greenland recorded a 14% year-on-year rise in international air passengers as of January 2025. Visit Greenland's reporting added another layer. Nearly three-quarters of the country's tourism operators noted increased bookings directly tied to Nuuk Airport's opening. For visitors, this meant fewer logistical hurdles. For Greenland, it signaled the arrival of a new scale of connectivity that promised opportunity, but also carried hidden costs. Locals describe how daily life has changed in ways large and small. Only a few years ago, a trip abroad often meant a long detour via Copenhagen. Now, residents watch passengers step straight from transatlantic flights onto Nuuk's tarmac. In Ilulissat, the sight of larger planes skimming the skyline has become a symbol of newfound visibility on the world stage. For others, the symbolism feels less powerful than the practical disruption. Longer lines at security, more complex flight schedules, and an airport that suddenly must operate at the capacity of a regional hub rather than a small stopover. Tourism operators are enthusiastic, highlighting the appeal of streamlined travel. Foreign agencies now confidently market Ilulissat or Nuuk as long weekend destinations, leveraging faster access to turn Greenland into a viable short-haul adventure spot for European and North American tourists. The effect is unmistakable. Hotel occupancy rates shoot upward during peak months, and bookings that used to be seasonal are increasingly spread across the year. But behind the optimism, strains are evident. Accommodation remains a central bottleneck. Visit Greenland has flagged serious short-term shortages in both Nuuk and Ilulissat, warning that airport expansion has outpaced the country's lodging stock. Municipal authorities in Nuuk have already set a target to add about 500 new beds by 2030, yet the demand curve is steeper than the construction timeline. For independent travelers, this reality means few affordable options during peak weeks. Visitors sometimes end up in temporary barracks built for construction crews or in apartments diverted from the city's already tight rental pool. The growth in arrivals has outstripped the pace of physical preparation, and it shows. These imbalances ripple outward into the daily rhythms of communities. In Ilulissat, restaurants occasionally run short of staples when import schedules can't match the pace of visitors. In Nuuk, city planners have had to rework traffic patterns to accommodate airport shuttle routes and parking needs. Basic services face heavier loads, from waste collection to water supply, and none of these systems were designed for sudden growth. The change may look invisible to the casual tourist, but for residents, it is unmistakable. Part of the strain comes from the nature of Greenland cities themselves: compact, resource-limited, and rigid in how quickly they can scale. What feels like a modest uptick in arrivals by international standards registers as rapid growth when measured against communities of only a few thousand people. A summer surge of several hundred visitors a day creates bottlenecks that locals compare to an influx several times larger than their towns can manage comfortably. The situation is less about extraordinary volume than about the mismatch between the pace of change and the scale of existing infrastructure. Workers at the airports describe the pressures in practical terms. The new jets require longer runways, more complex baggage systems, and entirely new standards of security checks. Flight controllers, once focused on regional routes, now monitor movements across the Atlantic corridor. Ground crews accustomed to handling single-prop planes adapt to back-to-back international arrivals, dealing with heavier cargo and faster turnarounds. Each adjustment adds up, creating a daily reality of strain that echoes the broader national picture. The opening of these international gateways has, in effect, connected Greenland to the pace of globalization. Yet it has done so before the supporting structures, housing, hotels, utilities, were adequately scaled. Government planners now regularly confront the gap between projections and reality, recalculating timelines as airlines add or shift routes. Meanwhile, residents are left to balance opportunities in tourism and business against rising everyday challenges. Foreign carriers and investors see Greenland as a promising frontier, but for those living closest to the runways, the question feels less about potential than about sustainability. Arrival numbers continue rising, but the infrastructure to receive those visitors lags behind. Municipal warnings echo with urgency. Airports cannot exist in isolation. They must be matched with long-term strategies for housing, energy, and urban development. The paradox is clear. Greenland's new gateways have undeniably placed the country on the map in ways politicians and tourism agencies long desired. Yet within this achievement lies a question. What happens to communities built for small-scale living when external arrivals grow faster than rooms, homes, and services? So what happens to housing and daily life when the flow of visitors outpaces the ability to host them? Tourism boom, housing shortage. The pressures around housing have now become the most visible side effect of Greenland's tourism surge. Visitors are arriving for iceberg cruises in Ilulissat, dog sledding in Sisimiut, and guided glacier treks outside Nuuk. These are once-in-a-lifetime experiences for travelers, but the growth behind them has begun to strain everyday life for households. Housing stock that once matched the needs of a small population is being stretched by seasonal visitors and rising investor interest, creating new competition for spaces that locals depend on. In Nuuk, the country's busiest city, changes are clearest. Short-term listings have increased, and some apartments once offered for long-term tenancy are now diverted toward tourist rentals. For landlords, the math is straightforward. Steady weekly turnover from visitors can meet or exceed what a family would pay across a month. This rewards owners but erodes stability for renters. Rather than unsourced double-digit jumps, National Banken points to a government housing program already in place. Annual rent increases of 3.8% over 15 years designed to clear maintenance backlogs. While this is technically a managed policy, the pressure of tourism amplifies how tightly households are squeezed in practice. Families already stretched by limited wages face decisions about sharing with relatives, moving farther from work, or devoting an outsized portion of income to shelter. Visit Greenland's analyses confirm what residents describe. The tourism satellite account shows tourism consumption of nearly 3 billion DKK in 2024, with 58% of that spending coming from international visitors. The sector directly accounted for 4.9% of Greenland's GDP and sustained around 1,800 jobs that year. But the same analyses caution that capacity is limited. Both Nuuk and Ilulissat are flagged for short-term accommodation constraints, meaning many arrivals are stepping into a market already tight for residents. The economic value of tourism is unmistakable, yet its scale magnifies the importance of how housing is managed. Hotel development is underway, with both boutique projects and larger chains taking shape. But construction brings its own problems. Building new facilities requires temporary foreign workers, and they too need housing upon arrival. In some cases, rooms built for visitors end up occupied by the very crews meant to deliver those hotels. Authorities and companies have used stopgaps, modular housing units, repurposed warehouses, or assigning blocks of unfinished buildings as dormitories. These temporary fixes ease immediate needs, but deepen the sense that urban neighborhoods are evolving in ways out of step with community rhythm. Permanent residents watch parts of the city shift into semi-permanent compounds, waiting for projects that may take years before serving their intended purpose. For employees taking advantage of new job opportunities, the gap is no less severe. Young Greenlanders working in hospitality or guiding tour find that pay does not keep pace with housing costs. Many rely on shared accommodations, sometimes rotating sleeping quarters to fit irregular shifts. The result is that even those working directly within the industry underpinning growth struggle to secure independent living spaces. They are, in effect, locked out of the comfort that the jobs were supposed to create. Smaller coastal communities face their own burdens. Teacher and health worker positions rely on stable housing allocations, but pressures from seasonal tourism disrupt this balance. Apartments once reserved for incoming staff are at times shifted to visitor stays instead. Teachers have reported difficulty extending leases, while nurses are housed in temporary staff quarters initially meant only for short assignments. Essential community services become harder to sustain if professionals cannot establish households. In towns with only a few thousand residents, or in some cases a few hundred, losing just one or two key workers to housing problems risks compounding shortages in education or healthcare delivery. As platforms spread, the number of short-term listings in Greenland increases quickly each summer. Investor interest, while modest compared to larger markets abroad, still factors into reshaping rental availability. A growing split emerges. Those who can capitalize on spare properties or secondary apartments see gains, while renters without such assets face fewer, more expensive choices. This widening gap is felt acutely in a country with populations small enough that shifts are immediately obvious. The imbalance is not hidden in the numbers. It shows in which families remain in central neighborhoods and which are pushed to peripheral housing stock. The strain is not confined to roofs alone. Logistics systems also struggle to catch up. Demand surges faster than freight shipping schedules can be adjusted, as National Bank highlights in its notes on infrastructure. Grocery shelves occasionally clear within hours when flights deliver more people than expected supplies can cover. In tourist centers, restaurants adapt menus based on shortfalls, creating moments where visitors and residents compete for everyday goods. While less dramatic than a housing crisis, these supply mismatches illustrate how the pace of arrivals affects daily living conditions. Government authorities are aware of these dynamics but constrained in their responses. Large-scale housing programs require land permits, financing, and often several years before families can move in. In the meantime, municipal offices spend substantial time managing rental disputes, weighing zoning permissions, and reviewing the release of new land plots. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Tourism expansion demands more labor, additional labor requires more apartments, and new construction brings additional temporary workers vying for the same housing pool. Each link drives demand forward even faster than policy can balance it. The speed of the change stands out most of all. Greenland spent decades forecasting around modest changes in population and seasonal rhythms. The sudden acceleration caused by new airport connections broke that slow pattern in less than 2 years. In Nuuk, cranes now dot the skyline, but residents wait on public housing lists or share crowded spaces while construction drags on. Students searching for apartments at the beginning of academic terms compete directly with summer tourists. Families rotate between temporary lodgings, while longer-term projects remain incomplete. Each visible sign reflects how infrastructure is lagging behind a social transformation already underway. As expectations climb for another record season, the uncertainty remains unresolved. Tourism has delivered recognized economic weight, billions in consumption and thousands of jobs tied directly to the sector. But housing availability has become an equally prominent storyline. Residents weigh whether the benefits of tourism offset the day-to-day pressures of rising rents and shifting neighborhoods. This question lingers in the private lives of families just as much as it shapes national policy. Housing is not just about shelter. It anchors where people live, work, and sustain themselves. If Greenlanders cannot afford to remain close to their jobs, every other economic shift, whether in tourism, mining, or the country's enduring dependence on the sea, carries different consequences. Fishing reforms and coastal survival. Fishing remains Greenland's economic backbone, shaping both national revenue and community life. Despite the rise of tourism and interest in mining, seafood still accounts for nearly 98% of Greenland's exports by value, according to recent Europarl and National Bank reports. That concentration brings strength in foreign markets but also vulnerability, since any shifts in fisheries policy ripple directly through the entire economy. At the start of 2025, a pivotal change arrived in the form of the new Fisheries Act, which redefines who fishes, how much they can catch, and on what terms. Law introduces several major reforms. It replaces parts of the communal Olympic-style coastal fisheries system with individually tradable quotas, meaning fishermen now need to plan and invest differently to secure long-term rights. It caps how much private companies can hold in quotas, sets stricter rules favoring Greenlandic ownership and residency, and installs multi-annual management plans intended to stabilize catch levels while conserving stocks like cod and halibut. Public and semi-public operators such as the state-owned Royal Greenland face different ceilings, while private companies, including major trawler firms like Polar Seafood, are restricted in their share of total quotas. Legislators argue these rules will strengthen local ownership and prevent excessive concentration in a few hands, but they have also sparked disputes across the industry. In places like Sisimiut, the harbor is lined with small vessels whose owners feel the impact immediately. Their seasonal routines once depended on local, short-range halibut fishing that provided steady income. Under the new system, the shift to tradable quotas introduces an added layer of financial pressure. Instead of relying only on their nets and boats, small crews now weigh decisions about buying or selling quota rights, often without the capital reserves larger companies enjoy. For some, that means operating at thinner margins. For others, selling their quota rights becomes an unplanned exit from fishing. The system is designed to make coastal fisheries more accountable, but on the ground it can feel like another hurdle placed before small boat operators. Trawler firms present a different narrative. With refrigeration systems, larger holds, and the ability to fish year-round, they argue that their efficiency ensures Greenland can maintain export levels and meet standards in competitive international markets. These industrial-scale actors generate significant foreign currency for the national economy, but smaller coastal crews say that efficiencies at scale cannot replace the day-to-day role of local fishing in sustaining families and towns. In their view, a quota system that privileges capital-heavy operations risks eroding a culture tied as much to identity as to income. Conflicts are further sharpened by the specifics of the law. While caps on private quota holdings were billed as a safeguard against concentration, companies like Polar Seafood have publicly criticized the reform, warning they may have to sell significant shares of their quotas while citing exemptions afforded to Royal Greenland, which is majority state-owned. Industry voices frame this as unequal treatment that props up one major player at the expense of others. On the opposite side, many independent fishermen see large firms, whether private or public, as having disproportionate influence in Nuuk, leaving smaller coastal communities to deal with reduced allocations and financial strain. The microstructure of the new system brings its own knock-on effects. In one example reported by local associations, some crews in South Greenland who relied exclusively on halibut are now considering whether to sell their new tradable quotas to larger operators, since the capital required to maintain vessels year after year outweighs the quota's immediate yield. What once was a straightforward activity, spending spring and summer fishing halibut in nearby fjords, now requires financial strategy and legal navigation. This adjustment may professionalize parts of the coastal sector, yet it also risks sidelining crews without reserves of cash or business support. The reach of quota reform extends beyond individual boats into processing plants and coastal employment. In Qaqortoq, reduced input from smaller fishers has immediate consequences for staff at local filleting and packaging facilities. Processing plants upgrading to handle larger trawler deliveries more efficiently often sideline smaller suppliers, whose irregular catches struggle to fit into production schedules designed around bulk shipments. For workers whose hours depend on steady flows of locally landed fish, the consequence is fewer shifts and less income. Municipal officials warn that diminished processing throughput affects not only households, but also tax revenue and the broader circulation of money in town economies. That tension between efficiency and tradition defines much of the current debate. Public authorities defend the 2025 Act by pointing to long-term sustainability. With cod and halibut stocks under pressure from warming waters and shifting migration patterns, they argue tighter quotas and structured management are essential safeguards. Allowing larger trawler firms to consolidate steady operations, they contend, ensures Greenland can maintain its revenue base and avoid dramatic collapses in fish populations. Yet to small-scale crews, conservation becomes synonymous with exclusion. The perception is that larger players can endure quota cuts by absorbing losses across multiple species and markets, while individual fishermen face immediate shortfalls that threaten mortgages, fuel bills, and daily survival. The cultural layer intensifies the stakes. Fishing as a family trade has deep roots, with knowledge of fjords and coastal routes passed down through generations. For crews operating 5 to 10-meter boats, reduced quotas are not only economic pressures but also signals that the continuity of their way of life is in jeopardy. Parents report discouraging their children from entering fishing, fearing unstable incomes and mounting regulation. As younger Greenlanders pursue studies abroad or move into tourism jobs, the link to coastal fishing weakens. Without a viable path for families to pass on the trade, communities risk cultural loss alongside economic challenge. Residents in small harbors describe the imbalance in everyday terms. They compare their early morning departures in small boats to the sleek trawlers that can remain at sea for weeks, backed by satellite tracking and refrigerated holds. This unevenness of scale reinforces a feeling that decision-making happens far from local realities, with policies drawn up in Nuuk or even Copenhagen-style frameworks, then applied to harbors where fragile routines hold entire towns together. From their perspective, the quotas may meet international standards, but they leave unresolved the question of community survival. Broader social consequences loom in the background. If families dependent on coastal fishing cannot sustain themselves, outmigration becomes more likely. Towns already balancing education and health care delivery on thin margins may see further depopulation. With each departure, the cost of running schools, clinics, and municipal services rises for those who remain. The sustainability of fisheries, therefore, is not measured simply in biomass, but in whether human communities tied to the resource can continue to function. Some fishers seek alternatives. A few coastal crews diversify by supplementing catches with boat tour for visitors or direct fish sales to tourists, blending fishing with the growing tourism sector. Others experiment with online content to augment earnings, turning the visibility of their trade into digital side income. These adaptations showcase resilience, yet they also underline the fragility of fishing as a standalone livelihood under the new rules. Instead of expanding tradition, they represent coping mechanisms in response to shrinking margins. The government's challenge is balancing these realities. The Fisheries Act was framed as a modernizing reform, stabilizing stocks, securing export revenue, and ensuring Greenlandic ownership. But 1 year into its implementation, it is also exposing sharper divides between industrial and local interests. The risk is that while national figures and export data show stability, the households closest to the coast continue to feel squeezed. Fishing still anchors Greenland's economy, but the trade is no longer a guarantee of stability for those who live by it. The reforms show that even the most established industries carry trade-offs when governance prioritizes broader conservation and export resilience. And just as fishing communities are grappling with their share of uncertainty, another sector is already pushing Greenland into equally difficult choices, with stakes not only economic but environmental. Mining concessions and environmental reckoning. Mining is drawing some of the sharpest lines in Greenland's national debate. In May 2025, the government granted a 30-year permit to Greenland Anorthosite Mining, a firm backed by the Gene Boole Group alongside Greenlandic investment funds. The project aims to extract anorthosite, a mineral useful in aluminum and fiberglass production, from deposits in southwest Greenland. Officials promoted the concession as a practical step toward building new streams of revenue, but the move also highlighted how much is at stake when industrial development arrives in fragile Arctic landscapes. Kvanefield, once the centerpiece of Greenland's mining ambitions, remains stalled by the country's uranium ban enacted in 2021. That law prohibits uranium extraction as either a primary or secondary activity, effectively barring energy transition minerals, formerly Greenland Minerals, from proceeding with its planned rare earths venture. The company has since launched arbitration claims against Greenland for substantial damages, warning of billions in lost opportunities. While specific figures remain contested, the litigation signals that the government is exposed not only to environmental and political risk, but also to prolonged legal battles with international investors. For Greenlandic leaders, the economic rationale appears straightforward. Danish subsidies account for a large share of public finance, and resource development is one of the few plausible paths to reduce this dependence. Mining royalties and related taxes could, in theory, fund public services and strengthen arguments for greater autonomy. Supporters portray projects like GAM's Anorthosite concession as test cases for building national capacity in resource governance, offering a chance to participate in global supply chains tied to green technologies. Yet the promise collides with stark environmental and social realities. Mining today employs less than 0.5% of Greenland's workforce, according to National Banken, and most major deposits remain far from commercial production. Greenland has only a handful of small mines in operation, and nearly all the large-scale projects remain in exploration or financing stages. Environmental assessments emphasize that mining in Greenland is not an abstract scenario, but a source of direct risk to other established sectors. At Kvanefield, runoff from waste rock could seep into fjords vital for cod and halibut, jeopardizing both exports and subsistence fishing. In Disco Bay, exploration activities interact with permafrost zones that are already destabilizing due to warming. Thawing ground threatens infrastructure while potentially releasing naturally occurring pollutants into meltwater streams. Cold Arctic conditions mean contaminants would persist longer than in temperate regions, raising the risk of long-term impacts. Local communities rely on these fjords and waterways not only for fisheries income, but also for drinking water, tourism activities, and subsistence hunts. The clash is not merely environmental versus economic. Tourism is marketed on Greenland's clean wilderness and pristine landscapes. Visible mining footprints, exploration roads, drilling platforms, or tailings facilities risk reshaping the international image that underpins growth in tourism revenue. Fishing, which still dominates Greenland's export economy, could also be undercut if global buyers perceive contamination risks. Leaders in Nuuk face the difficulty of aligning policies across multiple sectors, each of which is sensitive to environmental integrity and global reputation. Another layer of tension lies in who gains from these projects. Mining requires specialized labor and capital intensity. While construction phases offer temporary local hiring, many skilled jobs and contracts go abroad to experienced technicians and engineering firms. Critics warn that once the initial build-out passes, towns may be left with fewer permanent roles than promised, reinforcing patterns of dependency. Small communities hosting the sites bear the environmental burden and disruption, while uncertain about long-term employment. Foreign involvement magnifies these concerns. Mining concessions typically involve companies linked to larger state-backed enterprises or foreign investors with global supply chains. For Greenland, that introduces a contradiction. Resource revenues could advance economic independence from Denmark, but heavy reliance on outside firms risks shifting influence elsewhere. Environmental standards, waste management decisions, and export terms often fall under strategies driven more by corporate or foreign government priorities than by local communities. This question of sovereignty, control over how resources are extracted, processed, and sold, emerges repeatedly in debates at town meetings and parliamentary sessions. On the regulatory side, Greenland has struggled to keep pace with the complexity of industrial mining. Environmental frameworks exist, but enforcement capacity is limited in remote areas. Systems to contain waste or stabilize permafrost infrastructure are often modeled on temperate climates and may not withstand Greenland's intense freeze-thaw cycles, heavy snowmelt surges, or coastal erosion. The logistical costs of monitoring remote concessions add further challenge. Observers argue that every new concession compounds these pressures, requiring layers of governance that Greenland has not yet fully developed. Public opinion reflects these trade-offs. In towns near proposed sites, meetings regularly highlight the divide between enthusiasm for jobs and fears about long-term ecological damage. Parents raising children in areas dependent on fishing camps emphasize the risk of polluted fjords, while younger job seekers point to limited opportunities outside seasonal tourism. Some residents accept exploration with caution provided strict oversight is enforced. Others argue no management system can realistically eliminate risks. The result is a patchwork of local perspectives, often shaped by proximity to proposed projects and by the memory of how previous promises unfolded. Across Greenland, the discussion connects directly to the country's larger identity. Leaders who frame mining revenues as a route toward independence contend that failing to develop resources means remaining in a position of permanent dependency. Environmental and community advocates respond that pursuing mining without absolute safeguards risks undermining the very sectors, fishing and tourism, that allow Greenland to sustain itself. The central choice is not only about income, but about what values and images Greenland should project. A frontier of resource extraction or a society that prioritizes ecological resilience. As ice retreats in parts of South Greenland and exploration moves forward in Disco Bay, machinery already leaves visible marks across shorelines once defined by isolation. New roads cut across landscapes used for hunting. Storage depots rise near fjords that communities rely upon for daily life. The scale of intervention may be small compared to global mining operations, but in settlements of only a few thousand, such changes reshape the environment in noticeable ways. Each exploration license becomes a symbol of the broader dilemma. How much of the environment can be traded for revenue, and who decides the acceptable threshold? The conflict narrows into a dilemma that is both immediate and long-term. Mining offers royalties that could reduce reliance on external subsidies and finance housing, schools, and energy infrastructure. It also carries the possibility of permafrost collapse, water contamination, and damage to Greenland's most valuable fisheries and tourism assets. For a nation with under 60,000 people, the weight of these trade-offs falls unevenly on small communities nearest the mines, where ecosystems and livelihoods are directly intertwined. The concessions already approved prove that Greenland is not immune to global demand for critical minerals. But each step forward carries costs that show up quickly in fragile coastal towns. Whether mining becomes a cornerstone of national independence or a trigger for environmental and social disruption is not yet resolved, and it is unfolding in a moment when Greenland is under increasing scrutiny from abroad. The shadow of superpowers. Greenland's reputation as a quiet, distant territory is giving way to one shaped more by the interests of global powers than by its own ambitions. By 2025, this reality is clearer than ever. Chinese state-linked companies have expressed serious interest in Greenland's critical minerals, while American firms, supported by signals from Washington, seek to establish supply alternatives aligned with national security priorities. Russia focuses mostly on its own Arctic coastline and shipping networks, but still treats the waters north of Greenland as part of its wider strategic environment. These trends attract attention not only in Nuuk, but across global capitals. What was once seen as remote rivalry now finds concrete expression in Greenland's policy choices. A mining permit signed in Nuuk is discussed abroad as a marker of strategic alignment. A U.S. diplomatic visit is analyzed for its implications in Beijing. Chinese discussions of partnerships are debated in Washington. The language of contracts and development for Greenlanders often reads abroad like signals on a competitive board of influence. The Arctic once symbolized wilderness, but today it is cast as a frontier of strategy. China's declared status as a near-Arctic state underlines why its interest draws notice. Rare earth elements and critical minerals essential for electronics and defense systems sit at the heart of this attention. Chinese firms dominate much of the global market, but diversification through Arctic access would consolidate their position. In Greenland, several proposed partnerships and investments have emerged across the past decade, yet many of them have been slowed, blocked, or withdrawn. Some exploration bids never advanced to full approval, and others faced pushback from both Danish authorities and Greenlandic political leaders wary of over-reliance. This means China's current footprint in Greenland is limited, even if its ambitions are not. Observers emphasize this gap. Beijing's interest remains strong, but so far it has not translated into lasting control on the ground. The United States frames Greenland differently. American officials emphasize the need for supply chains independent of China. From the vantage of Washington, Greenland's potential mineral output is less about domestic Greenlandic economics and more about securing resources for defense industries and reducing dependency. Here, strategic weight comes not just from mining ventures but from already established defense arrangements. Under the long-standing U.S. Denmark security framework, the U.S. maintains operations at Pittafik Air Base, formerly Thule, used for missile warning and space surveillance. This base highlights Washington's historical presence and demonstrates why diplomatic signaling in 2025 carries tangible weight. For U.S. policymakers, Greenland is not simply an economic prospect but a cornerstone in Arctic defense. Russia's posture differs. Moscow's Arctic expansion is concentrated along its own northern coastline, where it has invested heavily in icebreakers, ports, and bases. Melting ice is opening the northern sea route with greater reliability, and Russia treats this as a future trade lifeline. While Greenland is not a site of Russian economic projects or military installations, its position along the North Atlantic means that changing maritime patterns increasingly touch its environment. Russia's naval capacity and shipping policies redefine the high north broadly, but experts stress that this activity does not yet translate to a sustained Russian presence in Greenlandic waters themselves. Greenland features in Moscow's calculations indirectly, more as a reference point than as a focal target. This distinction matters. Analysts at institutions such as DIIS and Belfer caution against overstating direct Sino-Russian footprints in Greenland. Sino-Russian cooperation in the Arctic to date is largely limited to energy and shipping projects within Russian territory. The image of heavily armed Russian patrols or significant Chinese port control in Greenland is not supported by current developments. Instead, the influence is subtler: investment bids, diplomatic visits, and rhetorical positioning. The perception of rivalry is real, but the material presence is more modest than headlines often suggest. For Greenlandic politics, this external attention carries weight far above local scale. Every contract or partnership is scrutinized internationally. A potential concession to a Chinese company is immediately read as a geopolitical tilt. Welcoming American investment is seen abroad as an exclusion of rivals. Danish authorities responsible for Greenland's foreign and security policy weigh these choices against NATO responsibilities. Greenlandic leaders, meanwhile, attempt to emphasize community needs and sustainable development, but find themselves enveloped within global narratives they do not control. Residents feel the external gaze acutely. Mining, airport expansion, or infrastructure projects become entangled with questions about whether superpowers benefit more than local households do. Opportunities are recognized: royalties, jobs, and new connections. But alongside these, the fear grows that the interest of outsiders so outweighs local capacity that Greenland's agency risks being eroded. Political debates in Nuuk often proceed under the shadow of whether resource management is about independence or about becoming a lever in someone else's strategy. Diplomatic visits reinforce this dynamic. American officials stress defense cooperation and emphasize partnership within NATO. Chinese delegations highlight mutual benefit through investment and development. Russian representatives frame the Arctic in terms of cooperative opportunities, but continue to expand infrastructure near their own northern ports. These gestures appear respectful, but observers note how they are interpreted abroad as signs of rivalry. To local communities, this kind of high-level attention can bring investment and recognition. To outsiders, each visit signals the distribution of influence and access to Arctic resources. Some analysts warn that the atmosphere looks like a repeat of Cold War logics. Greenland's history with U.S. military bases underscores this parallel. During that era, its geography made it essential to early warning systems. Today, the instruments are different, fewer troop movements, more industrial contracts, but the underlying competition echoes historical precedents. Energy resources, shipping corridors, and mineral deposits all carry weight as tokens of strategic power. For Greenland's government, the scale of outside interest brings unusual pressure. Its population and administrative resources are small, yet its decisions trigger extensive global interpretation. A simple choice to welcome or decline a foreign concession can be amplified abroad as proof of allegiance to East or West. Local leaders discuss jobs and infrastructure, while outside commentators analyze strategy. The gap between intention and interpretation leaves Greenland exposed to narratives it does not fully shape. Geography intensifies this. Between North America and Europe, and close to emerging Arctic routes, Greenland cannot avoid strategic consideration. Its location magnifies interest in ways that exceed its population's capacity to manage easily. Officials call for decisions rooted in community needs and sustainable growth, but in external media, these are presented as alignments within rivalry. The larger power's shadow stretches across everyday policymaking, whether it concerns minerals, shipping, or fisheries. Experts stress the need to balance hype with reality. Russia's Arctic militarization is real but concentrated along its own coast. China's interest is persistent, but its Greenland projects remain few, with many blocked or delayed. The United States not only pursues minerals, but already operates the long-standing air base and defense ties. These asymmetries demonstrate that Greenland is most closely tied in practice to Washington and Copenhagen, while China and Russia's presence remains limited compared to the speculation that often surrounds their names. Yet perception matters. Even a stalled Chinese mining bid or a rejected Russian overture is enough to generate debate in NATO forums or think tank studies. Greenland is increasingly discussed in global defense papers, strategy debates, and economic forecasts. Leaders accustomed to focusing on fisheries, housing, or tourism now see their decisions carried into international discourse. Each step in Nuuk seems to resonate in conversations far beyond Greenland's borders. By 2025, isolation is no longer the marker of Greenland's global role. It is now a focal point where outside attention meets local decision-making. Superpowers see opportunities in minerals, shipping, and security, even when their footprints remain partial or limited. For Greenlanders, the task is to sustain agency while managing offers and partnerships weighed not just for local value, but also for their global implications. The real contest lies not in foreign bases or fleets surrounding Greenland, but in who shapes contracts, who gains access, and how much space remains for Greenland itself to decide. And as this dynamic intensifies, every negotiation about resources or partnerships feeds into a broader discussion that extends beyond foreign influence alone. At stake is not only what Greenland accepts or rejects from the outside, but how these decisions frame its internal political trajectory, a question increasingly difficult to separate from its search for greater self-rule. Diplomacy at a tipping point. Diplomacy has become the newest arena where Greenland finds itself under pressure. The balance of autonomy within the Kingdom of Denmark, once a steady subject for academic debate, now plays out in full public view. Under the Self-Government Act of 2009, Greenland was officially recognized as holding the right to self-determination. This legal framework established that the Greenlandic people could ultimately decide their own future, and with it, the foundations of sovereignty were laid. In 2024, Greenland reinforced this trajectory by publishing its first foreign defense and security strategy, a move that signaled its intention to claim more agency in exactly those domains Denmark still controls. These steps anchor the current debates not in speculation, but in concrete political documents that set out Greenland's expectations for the years ahead. Within this framework, Greenland's leaders are clear. Control of natural resources must lie closer to home. Fisheries, tourism, and mining are the pillars of Greenland's economy, yet the authority to approve licenses or defend territorial waters rests primarily in Copenhagen. For Greenlandic officials, the contradiction grows sharper as local communities experience rising tourism, shifting quotas, and the first large-scale mining permits. From their perspective, if these pressures can alter daily life in Nuuk, Ilulissat, or Qaqortoq, decisions about managing them should rest with Greenland's own government, not an external authority. Denmark, in turn, stresses that responsibility cannot be divided so neatly. Defense and foreign policy remain with Copenhagen, and the growing importance of the Arctic has only underscored those commitments. Over the past 2 years, Denmark and NATO have stepped up monitoring across the Arctic, discussing investments in drones, naval capacity, and additional surveillance systems. Copenhagen presents these measures as support for Greenland as much as for Denmark and its allies. Yet for many in Nuuk, the reality is harder to reconcile. They point out that security upgrades arrive quickly, while schools and hospitals still confront shortages and delays. The symbolism stirs unease. Even as Greenland is cast as vital to strategic defense, it has less control over how its economic lifelines are handled. Diplomatic exchanges reflect this strain. Communications from Greenland to Danish ministries have grown sharper, citing Greenland's record of export revenues and demanding acknowledgement that sovereignty over resources is no longer a distant ambition. International analysts see this rhetoric as proof that dialogue about independence, while still cautious, has moved into a more practical phase. The focus is not an imminent break from the Kingdom of Denmark, but a determined push to claim authority over quotas, concessions, and the flow of revenue from natural wealth. Sovereignty has slid from abstraction into a practical question of governance. The complexity deepens when viewed through the lens of NATO and wider Arctic politics. Greenland provides essential space for allied forces and monitoring systems, including the long-standing American presence at Pittafik Air Base. At the same time, NATO has announced broader Arctic monitoring initiatives, ranging from space-based surveillance to expanded patrols. For Greenlandic leaders, this highlights a disconnect. If the world depends upon their territory for global security, why should they lack equal recognition in determining how nearby fish stocks or mineral deposits are managed? It is a political argument framed in everyday terms. If global actors claim importance, the local population should share in the authority. That reasoning resonates in small towns just as fiercely as in the capital. When foreign companies apply for large concessions, Ilulissat or Maniitsoq residents see contracts negotiated in Nuuk that later appear in headlines in Beijing, Washington, or Brussels. The debate over halibut quotas for small-scale fishermen echoes into discussions over European seafood imports. The sense develops that Greenland is already implicated in major power politics, whether or not the community itself sought entry into the conversation. Residents conclude that sovereignty is not a distant legal status, but a practical shield to ensure that local priorities are not eroded by distant trade talks or security calculations. The way politicians articulate the issue reflects this shift. Past leaders spoke of gradual steps toward possible independence, leaving timelines vague. In 2025, the tone has hardened. Leaders make plain declarations that sovereignty over resources is a non-negotiable expectation. While Copenhagen views resource management as tied to defense and foreign relations, Greenland insists on separating them. From Nuuk's vantage, decisions on fisheries or mining should not be delayed or diluted by broader alliance concerns. The two perspectives are colliding, one calling for compartmentalization and the other for integration. Practical pressures fuel the rhetoric. Housing shortages in Nuuk, wage gaps in the tourism industry, and the effect of quota reform on small fishing boats demand faster solutions. Greenlandic politicians argue that the current system, where approvals and oversight travel through Danish processes, slows responses and distances solutions from the citizens who most need them. They contend that local authority would allow immediate use of mining revenue to fund housing, or adaptation of quotas to shield at-risk small boat communities. For the public, this narrative makes sovereignty tangible, promising practical outcomes to everyday problems. Denmark responds by highlighting the scale of subsidy dependence. Annual support from Copenhagen funds a significant share of Greenland's budget, stabilizing health, education, and public transport. Danish officials warn that shifting too aggressively to resource-based revenues would leave Greenland vulnerable to global price swings and uncertain markets. Greenlandic leaders counter that subsidies feed dependency, locking the island into cycles of reliance. For them, resource control is the tool for breaking free of that dependence, even if the initial years bring volatility. The disagreement is not only about budgets but about philosophy, whether to embrace gradual transition or to force a decisive leap. Public opinion reflects the weight of history. A poll cited in recent research found that 85% of Greenlanders opposed any idea of joining the United States. This makes clear that while Greenland attracts global suitors, its debate is focused inward, finding a road to greater independence from Denmark, not trading one external patron for another. Sovereignty for most citizens means control over resources and revenues, not relocation under a new flag. The polling data underscores the point that identity and autonomy remain deeply Greenlandic in orientation, even against the sweep of international speculation. The attention of outside powers magnifies each step. Washington tracks Greenland's assertiveness as part of its rivalry with Beijing. China evaluates whether expanded autonomy might open space for new partnerships. Russia observes governance debates in Nuuk as signals of shifts in Arctic structures. Every voice, regardless of its source, flows back to Greenland's local forums, amplifying the sense of living at the center of debates that stretch far beyond the island's own borders. For citizens and politicians alike, this brings heightened visibility but also heightened risk. Households and communities feel the debate in different ways. Families connected to small fishing boats worry that new quota systems cut too deep under distant authority and embrace sovereignty as a lifeline. Young professionals in booming towns, facing expensive rents, ask whether Greenland-managed resource revenue could finally fund affordable housing. Residents of remote settlements fear the withdrawal of subsidies could hurt schools or health posts even worse. Each perspective highlights that sovereignty is not a uniform aspiration, but a contested one, shaped by the circumstances of people's daily routines. What makes 2025 pivotal is the recognition that neutrality is no longer viable. Greenland must push further in managing its resources, while Denmark must weigh whether retaining control hardens disputes that weaken the kingdom's cohesion. Each diplomatic move becomes magnified by NATO obligations and superpower attention, raising the stakes of decisions once kept low profile. The debate's transformation from background to foreground is evident in public meetings, parliamentary debates, and international statements. What was once an abstract academic theme now defines Greenland's public politics. Across these discussions, one difficult question begins to frame the future. Sovereignty over resources promises greater agency, but comes with mounting responsibilities. Schools, hospitals, housing, and transport all require stable financing. While Greenland argues that mining, fishing, and tourism revenues can carry this load, Denmark insists that the safety net cannot be stripped away without risking collapse. As Greenland pushes for control over its resources, can it manage the practical costs of independence, financing schools, hospitals, and infrastructure without destabilizing services? We'll look at how climate and economics complicate that choice next. Climate pressures and melting wealth. Greenland's ice sheet is shrinking, and the change is undeniable. Between 2002 and 2023, research from NASA and scientific studies reported that the island lost an average of about 270 billion tons of ice each year. This massive loss has made Greenland one of the largest single contributors to global sea level rise. For cities thousands of kilometers away, the impact translates into higher tides and stronger storm surges. For Greenland itself, it reveals rock and coastlines unseen for millennia, exposing new land seen by some as an opportunity for extraction. What emerges is a paradox. The same melt that signals danger on a planetary scale is the very force opening access to resources and routes that outside investors now pursue. Rivers now run through valleys that were icebound for generations. The streams carry silt, fresh water, and debris, altering shorelines as they carve their paths. Exploration teams move along these new corridors, building camps where thick ice had once made entry nearly impossible. Geologists examine bare rock newly exposed to the open air, mapping deposits that once existed only in satellite data. For locals, the irony is clear. What climate change takes away in stability, it provides in terrains suddenly valuable to global markets. In southern Greenland, the retreat of ice opens plateaus that allow seasonal routes for heavy equipment. Trucks that once would have sunk into snow or permafrost can now deliver drills and supplies. This reduces costs for surveying rare earth deposits or zinc veins, making exploratory projects more attractive to companies. The accessibility itself is part of the paradox. Without melting, the resources would remain out of reach. Yet the act of reaching them depends on the very process threatening ecosystems and communities. This paradox carries consequences beyond Greenland's borders. Rising seas generated by the island's ice loss affect low-lying nations around the globe. Warming waters shift fisheries and destabilize coastlines as far away as Asia and North America. Yet the same climate-driven disruption intensifies interest in Greenland's minerals, which are touted as essential for building wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. Instead of being cast purely as a victim of climate change, Greenland is increasingly positioned as a key participant in the world's search for solutions, even if the benefits and risks accumulate unevenly. Communities in Greenland experience the changes firsthand. Hunters notice that the safe period for traveling across sea ice grows shorter each winter. Fishermen find traditional stocks shifting as fresh meltwater changes salinity in the fjords. Entire villages face coastal erosion when thawing permafrost weakens the ground beneath homes and roads. Yet it is often the same climate disruption that draws companies offering contracts and promising new jobs. Families are asked to judge whether long-term survival depends on resisting extraction or embracing it for the sake of revenues that could improve schools, clinics, and local services. Foreign audiences interpret the melt through their own priorities. Investors remind policymakers that delay in tapping Greenland's minerals could slow the global renewable transition. Diplomats highlight how the island's resources strengthen Western supply chains. Activists publish images of dramatic ice cliffs collapsing, warning of the cost of development in such fragile conditions. Each glacier that retreats is described simultaneously as an environmental disaster and a resource frontier. This makes decision-making in Nuuk doubly complex. Every step attracts global commentary, often disconnected from the challenges communities face on the ground. Greenlandic scientists monitor the changes with precision, recording glacier movement, water flow, and permafrost shifts. They publish figures showing billions of tons lost annually, but residents experience these as daily disruptions: an unsafe harbor, a damaged road, a shortened hunting route. Policymakers, in turn, face dilemmas that blend science with survival. Approving a mine may help fund urgent housing projects, but poor waste storage in thawing ground could create toxins that persist for decades. Each decision feels less like balancing abstract numbers and more like weighing one set of immediate risks against another. The contradictions grow sharper when international narratives are added. Foreign media often describe Greenland as a pristine wilderness, yet in the same breath promote its minerals as essential for the green transition. Residents point out the inconsistency. They watch as outsiders label their island fragile and alluring while treating it as a warehouse of inputs for global industries. Their own speeches about local control or sovereignty often struggle to cut through a steady flow of international headlines that cast Greenland in terms far beyond its population's size or priorities. Tourism illustrates the paradox in another form. The retreating ice itself has become a marketable attraction. Travelers pay to watch glacier calving or to walk on ice formations before they vanish further. For some Greenlanders, this brings jobs and income. For others, it reinforces a sense of exploitation, as their communities bear the cost of erosion, flooding, and damaged infrastructure while the melt becomes a spectacle sold abroad. What looks like opportunity on the surface carries hidden costs that return directly to local residents. Permafrost thaw compounds the challenge. As ground layers release, legacy contaminants once locked in frozen soils may flow into rivers. Researchers warn this can mobilize harmful substances, including heavy metals, making water unsafe for small settlements that rely on natural sources. Thaw also undermines mine waste storage, raising the chance that tailings or chemicals escape containment. Added to this, black carbon emissions from ships and industry darken snow surfaces, accelerating melt by absorbing more sunlight. These complications underline how the environmental risks tied to ice loss are not theoretical. They are physical and chemical realities already unfolding. Residents differ in their views of the choices ahead. Some argue that only by embracing mining revenues can Greenland reduce dependence on Danish subsidies. Others believe that damaging fjords and coastlines erodes the very basis of the society's survival, undercutting fishing and hunting traditions that hold cultural as well as economic value. Independence and sovereignty are often central in these debates, but both ideas ultimately hinge on resource control. Melting ice opens new access while amplifying the price of exploitation. For a nation of fewer than 60,000 people, the weight of these global struggles lands heavily on individual communities. The symbolism builds each year. Greenland's ice sheet is a real-time measure of climate change, its retreat visible, documented, and global in consequence. But each new opening in the ice simultaneously presents possibilities that investors and governments insist are crucial for the future of renewable energy and global supply. The paradox is not abstract. It is the daily reality of a place asked to represent both crisis and answer at the same time. As glaciers collapse into the sea, they shape two distinct futures: rising waters that threaten life far beyond Greenland, and landscapes that investors claim can fuel industrial transition. Both paths pull against each other, yet both grow from the same process. The central question is whether Greenland can find balance, deciding which potential to pursue and at what cost. Melting ice both increases the feasibility of resource projects and multiplies the environmental stakes. So how will Greenland decide which path to take? The employment puzzle. Employment in Greenland shows progress on the surface, but underneath the numbers sits a more complicated story. Job growth in 2025 is real. Tourism supports guides, hotel staff, and service workers. Construction projects expand around airports and housing, and mining companies advertise long-term opportunities. Yet research shows that much of this growth depends on external labor. According to National Bank and data, nearly 2,300 foreign citizens of working age were registered in Greenland by the end of 2024, about 6% of the total working age population. At the same time, Visit Greenland's tourism satellite account reported that tourism provided around 1,800 jobs in 2024, a notable figure in a country of fewer than 60,000 people. Together, these numbers illustrate the dilemma. Growth is happening, but a significant share of the expertise and wages flows to people trained abroad. In Nuuk, the imbalance is visible even in job postings. Many advertisements circulate in English before they appear in Greenlandic or Danish. Companies expect applicants from outside, especially for technical roles that demand credentials Greenland's schools rarely provide locally. Mining engineers, geologists, and certified heavy equipment operators are recruited from Canada, Australia, or Scandinavia, often earning salaries well above the local average. Greenlanders more often take positions in cleaning, catering, or seasonal guiding. The result is not the absence of jobs but a mismatch. High-paying, skill-intensive work goes abroad, while available jobs at home cluster in lower-paid, less permanent sectors. Tourism highlights both the opportunity and the limits. Young Greenlanders take on roles as guides for dog sleds, hiking tour, or cultural storytelling. Restaurants and shops see bursts of business during peak cruise and flight arrivals, but those jobs remain seasonal. A strong summer may employ hundreds across coastal towns, but when winter closes in, most of these roles vanish. The cyclical nature of tourism makes it difficult to build stable livelihoods. Even students who earn in the summer months often leave abroad afterward, enrolling in training programs in Denmark or elsewhere to find longer-term prospects. Their seasonal earnings help families briefly, but the instability underscores why many do not see tourism as a career path capable of sustaining independence. Construction, too, has become a major driver of employment, but under tight constraints. Projects tied to airports, hotels, housing developments, and planned hydro facilities generate short-term labor spikes. However, contractors consistently draw on foreign workers to meet deadlines. National Banking and Arctic Today both document that labor shortages force Greenland to import skilled craftsmen, carpenters, masons, electricians, mainly from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. These crews arrive on fixed contracts, live in temporary accommodations, and leave once projects close. Greenlanders studying in local trades programs gain limited benefit in comparison, working as apprentices under foreign foremen or picking up lower-wage maintenance work after the initial construction is done. The result is infrastructure that serves Greenland, but wages that flow away in significant amounts. The official numbers still show rising employment, but they obscure the distribution. A young Greenlander leaving school today faces a stark decision: remain and enter lower-paying service roles that struggle to cover rising living costs, or depart abroad to secure specialist training without certainty of returning home. National Banking emphasizes the time lag involved. Technical qualifications in geology, engineering, or advanced trades often take years. By the time a student returns with a degree, major projects may already be complete or under foreign management. This lag reinforces a cycle where outside specialists dominate the early stages of industrial and infrastructure development. Mining operations make that reality even sharper. Companies advertise attractive wages for skilled technical staff, but require international certifications that Greenland's current education system rarely provides. This means environmental scientists, drilling operators, and site safety managers are often recruited from overseas. For Greenlanders, the comparison is immediate. They may work in support services such as food provision to camps, while foreign professionals manage extraction equipment on familiar terrain. The imbalance does not negate local involvement, but it makes clear who pockets the largest share of the payroll. Employment grows, yet the high-value segments remain dominated by outsiders. Generational expectations deepen the tension. Many Greenlanders under 30 want to contribute to building economic independence, but pathways are limited. Degrees abroad carry significant financial strain, and staying in Greenland without advanced training restricts options mainly to seasonal tourism or support services. For some, leaving becomes less a choice than an economic necessity, and once abroad, many do not return. Communities lose both professional expertise and the cultural continuity that might have anchored younger generations at home. The reliance on external workers is now evident across sectors. Hotels in Ilulissat recruit chefs and managers internationally, while mining ventures bring in specialist crews for exploratory stages. Even public works sometimes turn to foreign firms to ensure deadlines are met. Together, these patterns shape the employment puzzle. Greenland provides land and resources, oversees growth in visible industries, and records higher employment rates. But households continue to feel the unevenness as the most lucrative wages and contracts circulate through temporary foreign staff. Education is the most common answer offered. Greenlandic policymakers stress the need for vocational programs in geology, marine engineering, and construction management. These initiatives aim to ensure the next phase of growth employs more Greenlanders directly, yet education reform cannot be immediate. Students entering technical courses in 2025 may not finish for several years, long after foreign specialists have already staffed early industry phases. This time gap is both understandable and frustrating. It shows why improvements depend not only on opportunity, but on aligning the pace of training with the pace of industrial change. One illustration comes from the new airports. Their construction demanded specialized contract labor, from architects to heavy equipment operators, most of whom were recruited abroad. Greenlanders joined as apprentices or in auxiliary roles, while experienced staff ensured deadlines were met. Similar dynamics surround hydro projects, where foreign crews manage complex technical requirements while Greenland relies on their expertise. In each case, the demand is real, the infrastructure completed, but the country remains tied to outside help in carrying it out. Communities adapt in smaller ways. Fishermen offset lower quotas by guiding tourists, while hotel workers experiment with side businesses that target visitors more directly. These hybrid strategies allow some families to capture additional income. Still, the earnings cannot match the higher wages offered to foreign engineers or project managers. The structure of the economy continues to privilege imported skill sets over local labor, even as overall employment rates climb. The employment puzzle stands at the center of Greenland's wider transformation. A jobs boom promises opportunity, but unless Greenlanders can access the sectors at the top of the wage scale, the benefits remain uneven. Current patterns risk creating an island where resources flow outward, dependence deepens, and independence remains an ambition rather than a reality. The challenge for policymakers lies in aligning training, education, and industry, so that citizens participate not only at the margins, but in the highest value roles. Efforts have begun. Expanded vocational training, targeted scholarships in technical fields, and partnerships with international institutions aim to prepare Greenlanders for future industry demands. But training timelines are long and industries do not wait. Even optimistic scenarios suggest years will pass before local workers fill the specialist positions now staffed from abroad. This delay emphasizes why employment outcomes remain a political as well as economic question. For Greenland's government, employment strategy is not simply about numbers. It is about whether citizens feel included in the transformation reshaping their country. If locals continue to see outsiders manage construction, mining, and tourism from top positions, trust may erode despite official reports of economic growth. If Greenlanders instead see themselves promoted into technical and managerial roles, the broader dream of sovereignty acquires credibility. Building this trust takes time, but without it, the employment puzzle remains unsolved. Greenland's future will depend on how quickly training reforms can narrow the gap between opportunity and access. The policies are on the table, the programs are being designed, but the results lie years ahead. And while Nuuk discusses reforms, other parts of the country watch from a distance, weighing how much of the new growth ever reaches their towns. The sense of inclusion or exclusion emerging from these choices sets the stage for the next part of Greenland's story. Communities at the edge. Beyond Nuuk's airport towers and Ilulissat's new hotels lie communities where change feels faint and distant. Accommodation on Greenland's east coast is one of these places. With little more than 400 inhabitants, it represents the challenges faced by the smallest settlements, where fragile supply lines dictate daily life. National Banken and Arctic Today both note that about 7% of Greenland's population still lives in settlements with fewer than 200 residents. For them, goods arrive through irregular shipping routes that ice often blocks, or by small planes landing on short gravel airstrips. A single delayed cargo shipment can leave food and fuel in short supply for weeks. In 2025, as new airports attract global headlines, families here still rely on tenuous lifelines shaped by weather and distance. Infrastructure reflects these constraints. Major investments target towns that hold most of Greenland's population and economic activity. Airports at Nuuk and Ilulissat proposed hydro projects and planned large-scale housing programs. These choices make sense in economic terms. They respond to congestion, tourism growth, and energy demand in the centers where most people live. But in Accommodation or small West Coast villages, funding depends on local municipal budgets stretched thin across vast territories. Docking facilities, warehouses, and communication systems may run for decades without comprehensive upgrades. Residents know the difference. While Nuuk receives construction cranes and foreign contractors, they make do with structures designed for smaller populations in slower times. The perception that small settlements sit at the bottom of budget priorities cuts more deeply than just logistics. These places are not only towns, they are custodians of Greenlandic traditions tied to subsistence hunting, fishing, and collective resilience against harsh winters. Hunters travel out across the ice with dogs and sleds, relying on skills honed over generations. Families share meat throughout the community. But when investments bypass these settlements, residents feel not only economic exclusion but cultural disregard. As decisions flow toward the country's larger centers, they fear that the identity preserved in their daily practices is ranked lower than airports, cruise docks, or mining deals. The mechanics of supply remain the most fragile link. Cargo liners come when the sea ice allows, sometimes only a handful of times in a season. Fresh produce, fuel, and building materials arrive in inconsistent bursts. If storms delay even one shipment, shelves empty quickly and families stretch supplies as best they can. Planes flown in for emergencies carry limited cargo and at a high cost. These cycles are described in reports on Arctic logistics as unavoidable realities of remote living, but on the ground they mean long weeks where residents face scarcity without alternatives. For older generations, these experiences echo what they have lived before. For younger people, they amplify doubts about staying. At the same time, economic growth in Western towns underscores the contrast. Nuuk's skyline changes with new apartment blocks and high-rise offices, staffed partly by foreign workers. Ilulissat's waterfront fills with tourists disembarking from international flights. These stories of success carry Greenland into international headlines. For Economies, the narrative is reversed. Outsiders rarely travel here, and no steady tourism sector feeds into household income. School teachers and shopkeepers speak of watching transformation in other towns only through the radio or social media, knowing few of the benefits come eastward. In community halls, parents discuss hard choices. Sending children to continue studies abroad often means they do not return. Staying offers limited schooling, sparse job options, and little connection to the modern economy. Greenland's push for broader autonomy and eventual independence raises sharper concerns. If the smallest settlements are already thinning out as youth leave, will they survive long enough to contribute to that project? National Banken forecasts a national population decline to about 45,700 by 2050, with a significantly older age profile. For settlements already losing their youth, the numbers imply an even starker future. Without fresh generations, schools close, clinics shrink, and traditions lose their continuity. Connectivity illustrates the everyday weight of distance. Internet service is intermittent. Schoolchildren may find their lessons interrupted for hours, days, or longer. Businesses cannot run online orders or payments reliably. Participation in the global economy falters not because of a lack of interest, but because the digital bridge breaks under pressure. Arctic Today described this digital divide as a central factor holding back small communities. In a nation where cruise operators advertise online and tourism guides find clients on global platforms, those without steady connections fall further behind. For small settlements, weak telecommunications sharpen isolation, setting boundaries not only on communication but on opportunity. To adapt, some households still combine subsistence with small-scale trade. Cooperative fishing ventures bring modest returns. Limited ecotourism programs offer unique experiences, though attracting visitors without reliable transport remains difficult. Cruise companies seldom visit, preferring West Coast harbors with stronger infrastructure. The imbalance is stark. While a city like Ilulissat thrives on tourist dollars, Economies watches outsiders bypass its coastline. A few experiments survive, but the gap in revenue compared to larger towns reflects the wider disparity between Greenland's growth zones and its forgotten edges. The demographic consequence is migration. As work and education concentrate in Nuuk, Sisimiut, and Ilulissat, smaller settlements contract. Each departure leaves schools with fewer children, medical posts with fewer staff, and businesses with fewer customers. The elderly remain, but younger families often choose better prospects elsewhere. Institutions thin out and services collapse, which then justifies further withdrawal of investment. This cycle, projected in population studies, suggests that unless deliberate measures sustain them, some settlements may indeed disappear. What makes decline more painful is that it threatens not only population but heritage itself. Communities like Economies root their identity in practices woven into Arctic survival: sled dogs, hunting trips, seasonal migrations to fishing grounds. These are not simply cultural symbols for museums or tourists, they are everyday realities connecting people to landscape and sea. When settlements fragment, so do the lineages of skill and memory. The paradox emerges. Greenland markets these traditions as cultural assets in larger towns and to tourists abroad, but the communities that keep them alive face neglect. Officials face a dilemma that cannot be smoothed over with statistics. Supporting remote places requires disproportionate spending for small populations. But in ignoring them, Greenland risks building an economy of two faces: urban centers linked to global markets and declining villages where culture once thrived. When independence is debated, advocates in these small communities emphasize that sovereignty without inclusion is hollow. If autonomy is to be meaningful, they insist, it must cover even the farthest edge of the island, not solely its busiest airports or deepest mines. Government programs have tried to shrink the gap. Subsidies for shipping aim to offset high costs, and communication upgrades promise stronger connections. But these often arrive slowly, announced in plans but felt years later. Residents cope with their own short-term decisions, sometimes by relocating. For a small town, each family that leaves carries more than belongings. They remove skills needed for collective hunting trips, reduce the number of children in classrooms, and shrink the networks that allow small groups to endure Arctic strain. The fragility of Greenland's transformation in 2025 is visible here most clearly. National headlines report bigger airports, fisheries reforms, and initial mining concessions. But Economies tells another story: survival on a knife's edge of supply delays, demographic thinning, and cultural risk. As political leaders weigh how to harness revenue and expand independence, the question grows more direct. If development concentrates in a few towns, how will Greenland preserve services and culture in its most remote places? That question extends beyond budgets or infrastructure. It points toward what defines Greenland to itself and to the world. And as pressures reshape work, land, and livelihoods, another theme grows urgent: how communities sustain the cultural practices that remain their most vital connection to identity. Balancing culture and change. In Greenland, the question is no longer whether culture remains present, but how it adapts under rapid change. What once carried on uninterrupted, sled dogs, subsistence hunting, communal food traditions, is now reshaped by tourism, modernization, and global visibility. Balancing culture and change has become one of the country's most pressing challenges, as practices that define identity encounter new pressures and new audiences. Sled dogs provide a clear example of this transformation. For centuries, they were essential for survival, pulling hunters across sea ice in winter. Today, sled dog use has declined as snowmobiles provide a faster and, in some regions, cheaper alternative. Rising costs for feed make keeping large teams difficult. Yet dogs remain because they now play a role in tourism. Travelers pay for short rides, often framed as authentic Arctic experiences. Dogs that once hauled supplies from one settlement to another now pull visitors for day trips. The animals are still visible, but their purpose has shifted, from necessity for families to spectacle for guests. Hunters recognize the shift acutely. A long sledge journey, once a means to gather seal or fish for survival, is shortened to a curated excursion. Harnesses may be brighter, routes safer, and stories adjusted to meet what visitors expect. This creates income but also unease. Some hunters grow comfortable guiding tourists, seeing it as a way to maintain dogs with financial support. Others argue that traditions altered for entertainment no longer serve their original meaning. The debate is not about whether sled dogs disappear, but about what role they now fulfill, and whether that role is defined internally or externally. Hunting itself remains a vital cultural anchor. Seal, whale, and fish continue to provide meals and hold importance in coastal communities. But international opinion adds pressure. Visitors arriving with foreign perspectives sometimes perceive hunting in conflicting ways, sparking debates that stretch across media and policy forums. For Inuit communities, the act is both subsistence and heritage, tied to generations who endured harsh conditions. Yet, as tourism expands, some hunts are introduced to visitors in staged formats. Families and community leaders must weigh how much to display, how much to commercialize, and how much to reserve for their own use. Food traditions also evolve under new pressures. Items such as madak, dried fish, and seal meat reflect survival strategies that endure across centuries. In Greenland's smaller towns, these foods still appear on family tables and in community events. But in restaurants built for tourists, they may appear selectively, presented as tasting experiences at premium prices or sometimes omitted entirely. Locals question whether their everyday foods are being recast as novelties shaped by outsiders, or whether removing them protects authenticity. The issue sits at the center of the cultural debate. When does presenting tradition sustain awareness, and when does it commodify it? The commercialization of culture is visible in tourism marketing. Dog sled rides, kayak journeys, and village visits are advertised widely as cultural immersion. However, what visitors receive is often adjusted: shorter routes, safer schedules, or symbolic clothing worn mainly for effect. These changes do not erase culture, but they reshape it. Hunters and cultural leaders express concern that staging traditions for a tourist's gaze might distort meaning. Visibility increases, but the performance risks taking precedence over lived practice. The tension lies in deciding whether tourism strengthens or narrows culture, and who gets to decide. Greenlandic youth feel this pull most directly. One path sustains tradition, learning hunting skills, mastering sled dogs, and practicing crafts. The other path offers modern wages through mining, construction, or tourism. A teenager guiding a sled tour may earn income, but mastery of dog handling and survival techniques requires years of committed engagement. Without such continuity, oral knowledge and survival practices fade. Many elders voice concern that younger generations will know culture only as surface encounters, rather than foundations of their identity. Education illustrates this intersection. Schools in larger towns teach Greenlandic language and history, but modern realities shape student experience. Coursework often requires Danish or English, international media fills their screens, and wage employment becomes a dominant aspiration. Parents now encourage children towards stable jobs even if it means reducing participation in subsistence hunts. Tradition is not abandoned, but it gradually becomes secondary. Sustaining Inuit perspectives requires conscious focus in classrooms, rather than reliance on continuity alone. Tourism proponents highlight benefits that cannot be ignored. Dog sled tour help finance feed for animals that might otherwise be abandoned. Visitors purchase locally made items, giving crafters and seamstresses incentive to continue, yet income is uneven. Larger tour companies capture most profits, leaving small artisans with limited gains. Communities note that rituals once shared organically are now repeated as staged performances, running on schedules tied to visitor arrivals. The dilemma persists. Culture receives visibility and money, but at the cost of being reshaped to fit external demands. Language and narrative are also affected. Tourism campaigns brand Greenland with terms like pure or untouched wilderness. Residents observe that these descriptions are rarely accurate. Daily life blends rifles and nets with imported food, combines snowmobiles with sled dogs, and mixes modern houses with practices rooted in the land. Culture is not frozen, it evolves. Reducing it to marketing imagery strips away its complexity, leaving a static picture in place of a living system. Crafts tell a parallel story. Seal skin clothing, beadwork, and carvings carry deep cultural expression. As tourist demand grows, items are sometimes simplified to suit volume and price. For some artisans, this shift means stability. Income from foreign buyers allows them to continue creating. Others worry that significance is lost when designs prioritize quick sales instead of embedded meaning. Culture becomes a product rather than an inheritance, raising concerns about whether heritage serves community first or market first. Community rituals face similar pressures. Celebrations once held within villages increasingly attract cameras. Dances and songs once performed for family or seasonal gatherings are presented to visitors. This increases global awareness, but some residents feel rituals lose intimacy when performed for audiences. To protect what matters, some communities set boundaries, distinguishing between what can be shared and what remains private. These lines are difficult to maintain, but they highlight the need for agency in deciding how culture is expressed. Examples from Greenland's own leaders and research institutes emphasize that community control is central. Several initiatives encourage Greenlanders to make decisions about how culture is presented, whether in tourism, crafts, or education. The balance lies not in rejecting external attention, but in shaping it deliberately. Policies rooted in local authority ensure culture is not only visible to outsiders, but also meaningful within Greenland itself. In this approach, culture is not a passive resource to be consumed, but an active system guided by those who live it. Despite all pressures, resilience threads through communities. Sled dogs still wait tethered outside homes, elders still instruct youth in storytelling and hunting, and crafts continue in local workshops. These practices persist, though adapted and sometimes strained. Their survival depends not only on income or visibility, but also on space for continuity. Culture endures best when lived as daily life, not only when staged for external expectations. Stakes are personal as much as they are political. In one interview cited in background reports, an elder remarked that seeing sled dogs rebranded as tourist rides left him proud they still run, but concerned they are no longer part of necessity. The remark captured a deeper unease, that what keeps culture alive may also risk transforming it into something different. Such voices remind Greenland that preserving heritage requires more than preservation of symbols, it requires safeguarding meaning. This is where Greenland's balance must be found. Its culture is both its strength and its vulnerability, the element most admired globally and the aspect most at risk from being reshaped. As Greenland moves deeper into economic and political transformation, its people carry the responsibility of directing how traditions are lived and shared. Without that agency, culture risks becoming backdrop rather than backbone. With it, there remains a path where heritage remains rooted while still adapting to a changing world. That balance is fragile, and it defines much of Greenland's present moment. The country is no longer only defined by remoteness but by the clash of visibility, modernization, and identity. These pressures reach into nearly every settlement and every household, and they introduce the same overarching question that now surrounds Greenland on the global stage. As change accelerates, who truly benefits from what is gained and what risks being lost? In 2025, Greenland faces a genuine economic opening. The new international airport in Nuuk is creating direct connections, and projects like the 30-year anorthosite permit granted to Greenland anorthosite mining signal long-term investment. Alongside planned hydropower projects, these shifts mark the most tangible opportunities the country has seen in decades. But the distribution remains uneven. The 2025 Fisheries Act, the National Bank-backed housing program, and education reforms show that policy choices will determine whether benefits reach coastal families or concentrate in larger towns. Local governance decisions carry heavier weight than the headlines about new foreign contracts. Geopolitics adds another layer. Experts caution that talk of foreign militarization near Greenland is overstated, but the strategic interest is real. What matters most is the degree of Greenlandic agency in negotiating with outside powers that see minerals, routes, and bases as part of their own agendas. So the choice narrows to agency, distribution, and sustainability. Who should decide Greenland's future? Local communities, leaders in nuke, or outside investors? Tell us your perspective in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more discussions.